Hello, everyone. For this book club, we did Extra Lives by Tom Bissell. I'm just going to say right off the bat, I don't really like this book that much. It's kind of dated. It's about 7 or 8 years old. Um, some of the things that Tom says in this, I really don't agree with very much. But for the most part, it's a pretty good book. It's not one that I would probably pick up and read again. If you want to have like another perspective on sort of like game development and sort of a way to critique games, then definitely look at this book because he goes about it in a different way. He talks mostly about story-based games, which are kind of the ones that I'm more used to now. They're the games that I like to play more. Um, he does go through some of like the usual tropes, talking about violence in video games, talking about a few of the other things. So you have violence, you have uh, just like the overall criticism of games, sort of like the control mechanics, and also kind of the clunky dialogue that goes into some of them. And these are all part of sort of building the story of how video games matter to us, kind of trying to bring out sort of why people play video games, why I you should really think of them as in a different way. Uh, Tom talks a little bit about sort of how our video games art in this. He kind of takes the thought of no. I can see where he's coming from. Uh, Personally, anything, in my opinion, anything can be art. If you want to call a video game art, then sure, it can be. But I mean, it's really just a personal opinion. Some games are not, some games are. It all kind of depends on the way you look at it. Uh, the first thing that we get into in the first chapter is talking about dialogues. Tom is a professional writer, and obviously way more successful than I will ever hope to be as a writer. And so he kind of takes issue with the ways in which dialogue is written and dialogue is delivered in video games, which is understandable. I mean, if you spend your professional career writing dialogue, then obviously when you look at a video game, you're going to be like, wow, that is really clunky. Or, wow, that's pretty bad. And while he has a point, while I see what he's talking about, I never really thought too much about the dialogue in games. I've criticized it before, saying, wow, this is kind of stupid, or this isn't really how people talk. And the major reason for that is in video games, you didn't always have a professional writer actually there, like from the very beginning. Sometimes they would make the game and be like, okay, well, we have a story, now we need to get some dialogue in there to get the characters talking, that sort of thing. So go out and hire somebody. Yeah, we're almost done with the game, but we just need somebody to come out here and just like write dialogue. And that worked for a while, but once games became more story based and everything, people started looking at them in a much different way. I mean, you look at games like the Telltale series; they have some fairly decent dialogue. There's still issues with it, and some other modern games where there's still some questionable dialogue and other things in there. I don't harp on games too much about this unless it's like really really egregious. Uh, Tom kind of takes a different narrative. He still plays them quite regularly, but at least at the time of the writing this book was finished in about what was published in 2010 or 2011. So I don't know if he still plays games to this day, or like what his if his thoughts have changed at all, but it's kind of besides the point. We move on into a little bit of like the controls and whatnot, and he talks a lot about the first Resident Evil, where I think the best way they've been described is it has tank controls, where you press forward or up on the D-pad and you're always going in a straight direction, then you have to kind of maneuver the way that you are from there, and then you have to like press different buttons to aim your gun. You never really understand or know where you're pointing, but it sort of adds to that like panicked feeling. And while he's critical of the controls and everything, he makes a few good points about how controls in a game can sort of build upon the actual story. They can get across some of the narrative of, this is really urgent, we're trying to make something kind of panicked and make you really nervous while you're playing a game. And for me, a lot of horror games do this very well, where they tell a story not specifically through dialogue and not specifically through like the overall story, but they tell it through the atmosphere, they tell it through like the way you have to control things, they tell it through like many different ways. And that's kind of what Tom is getting at as you go through some of these other chapters. Like, there are different ways to tell a story, not just through like a written dialogue. It's kind of why video games are different from, books, from television, that sort of thing. He does talk a little bit about different forms of entertainment in here, but I don't really want to get into it 'cause it's not really that important for the book, to be honest with you. He then talks. There's a really weird chapter in here where he goes to a convention / award show in Las Vegas called DICE, and he sits in he doesn't participate, but he's watching a panel on believability. I really don't know why this chapter is in the book, to be honest with you. It just seemed really weird. A bunch of people talking about the believability of video game characters and the believability of other aspects of video games. I honestly, I kind of tuned out during the chapter. I made it through the whole thing, but I was sort of like, I don't know why this is in here, to be honest with you. It was just kind of a weird thing for it to be, but it's very strange. It does get across sort of the fact that stories do matter in video games, and characters matter in video games. And you need to have some kind of a connection with the character that you're playing in order for you to like really get or at least to get the emotion that the programmers want. They don't always get that emotion. Sometimes they get the exact opposite of what they're looking for. For example, I think there's a point where he talks a lot about. There's a chapter on Far Cry 2 where he's talking to the developers for Far Cry 2, and he's explaining to them, yeah, I didn't have the same reaction that you were hoping for in it. It's kind of a funny little paragraph or like a sentence or two, but it sort of shows that the player is really driving the story more. Like, the player is getting other things out of the story aside from what is actually trying to get, what the developers or the writer for the games are trying to get across. And that can happen with pretty much anything. Like, you could write a game where, or for example, you could write a game or you could write a story where you think there's a very clear, defined message, and the player gets something totally different from what you're thinking. It's sort of a funny way to look at it, but it's very true. I kind of liked that part. Some of the other parts of the chapter, I was like, I don't really need to know all of the backstory for this, but it's kind of helpful. He does talk a lot about indie games in here as well. It's not really like an entire chapter, but there's quite a bit of talk on indie games, and I think indie games are one of the places where the industry can actually take a lot more chances and has had like a lot of success with like sort of the ideas that you wouldn't really think about. If you think back to the previous book we did about philosophy and that sort of thing, that's something that can be really expanded upon in an indie game. Whether or not you would want to play that game is totally up to you, but indie games do something different than like the big budget AAA games, because an indie game's not trying to please like a stockholder or a company. It's just kind of like, okay, I can experiment with this sort of idea, put it out, and if people like it, awesome. If they don't, okay, that's fine. With the AAA releases, they sort of have to tread they can be controversial, but they kind of have to tread a middle ground. You saw that a little bit with the most recent Far Cry game, where they had a pretty good idea, but they were worried about backlash, so they didn't really go all the way. At least that's the perspective that I got from it. I could be a little bit off, but that's sort of the idea that I got from that. Okay, here. Oh, then we get into RPGs. RPGs are they're not necessarily my favorite type of game, but they are really high up there. Most role playing games are really story driven, especially whether you're playing like a tactical role playing game or just a JRPG or even a Western RPG. You have to get your players to really get committed to the character. Even if you do something crazy like me where you have like the overall story but you don't really pay that much attention because in your mind you're formulating your own like sort of parallel story that's going along with it that you kind of enjoy a lot more than the one that's actually being told. But this is where storytelling really comes into play, where you have to like have an overarching theme, sort of we're going to go get this bad guy, but on the course to that, or on the course to that ending, you can do different things. You can tell other side stories. You can expand on the characters a lot more. And I think now that most people are more like trained to actually play RPGs, and I know that sounds kind of weird, but if you think back to like the original role-playing games, people didn't really play those too much. At least they weren't really mainstream. Like the original Final Fantasy, the original Dragon Quest, those didn't do that well in the U.S. It took people a while to sort of get used to them. It wasn't until 7 where everybody was like, oh my, or Final Fantasy 7 where everybody was like, oh my god, this is amazing. And then they start going back and they got to revisit Chrono Trigger, revisit Earthbound, revisit Final Fantasy 6, Final Fantasy 4, and the other Dragon Quest games. And then you start to find like all these other games that are telling these really interesting stories, especially now, where they sort of take the RPG mold and they sort of like hybridize it with other stuff. Most of this, what I'm saying, is not in this book, but it's still sort of the overall idea of RPGs being a pretty good way to tell a story and a really good way to get sort of like those moral choices and the ethical choices across to the player. And that's something that he does talk about when you bring up games like BioShock or you bring up games like Mass Effect, where the choices that you make are sort of like kind of influence the game. Especially with Mass Effect, the way you choose things will actually sort of mess around with the narrative. One really good game to talk about this. It's not really a role playing, but I could kind of see how it would work out that way. Until Dawn, where you have like the butterfly effect thing that they're doing, where like one choice will totally change the way the game is being played, and it can kind of affect the way it'll affect the ending and also affect like other things within the game as well. Those are things that games back in like the 90s or so you couldn't really do that with. Even in the early 2000s, people really weren't talking too much about that. It wasn't until like the later 2000s and then into sort of the more modern day to day where you find games that give you those moral choices and whatnot, those moral and ethical choices that really sort of push like the boundaries of storytelling. He gets into a little bit of that, but it's not quite not quite as deep as this, but that's mostly because the games he's talking about, at least at this point, are like 10 years old and games have gotten a lot better. So that kind of gets us into sort of the last part here. We get in kind of the aspects of freedom in your narrative. And this is where he was talking about Far Cry 2, and he brings up another game that I can't remember, and I stupidly did not write it down. But sort of like the freedom to do things within the game, and sort of like leave the story behind and then come back to it. These are kind of looked as more of like the open world games now, where you can we'll take Zelda Breath of the Wild, for instance. You don't have to get the Master Sword to win the game, but you can. And there are a lot of side quests and everything else in it that you can like go off and do and then come back to the main narrative whenever you want. You've got the freedom to kind of go anywhere and pretty much do anything. Fallout is another. Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 are like this as well, where you can just go and do pretty much anything. You can explore the world at your leisure and then come back to the main story whenever you want. That's sort of what the modern games were moving to back in like the early, or sorry, in the in the early 2010s, sort of the late 2000s. This is a weird decade for me to categorize. Basically like 2008 until like 2010 or 2011 when this book was published. It's kind of where games were moving in that direction. And you see that more now, where the open world games are really, really impressive and they give you an awful lot of options and everything. So, my final thoughts on this book is it's a little outdated now. I mean, some of the things that are talked about in this have kind of progressed. I mean, I do have to realize that I'm looking back at this book from 10 years ago, basically 10 years ago, and I'm trying to not put it into a modern perspective, but it's really hard to do when you're talking about video games, especially when there wasn't like a huge gap between the two generations of like PS3 and PS4. What I do like about it is he talks a lot about the story-driven games. He talks a lot about how dialogue and narrative can tell the story, and he does bring up some of the other things that you can use to tell a story in a game besides just the overarching narrative and sort of the dialogues between the characters. And yeah, it's a really good one, but I do have to say, like, he kind of forgets about whether or not the players find these games fun or not. And that's not really talked about by the developers that he interviews or the other people in the industry that he talks to. It's like, yeah, we made this great game and it's got all this fun stuff in it. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, but like, how did you program fun into the game? How did you make the game fun for the player? Because if you have an amazing story, but the gameplay is horrible, then the player is just going to tune the hell out, and he or she is not really going to care about what's going on. And that's a pretty big problem for like most video games, especially even today. I mean, you look at some games where story is not even remotely important. Like sports games, there doesn't need to be a story there. It's just you're trying to win the championship. Even in the my player modes for a lot of these, like, who the hell cares? You're just trying to make your guy as best as he can. Fighting games, I don't really care about the story for fighting games, to be honest with you. I don't really need a story for those. It's just you get your players out, you get your characters out there, and you beat each other up. Beat 'em ups, I don't really care about the story, to be honest with you. But, you know, those are just a specific slice of games. Mostly when you're talking about the games where story matters, you're talking, action adventure, you're talking your RPGs, you're talking that sort of thing. And that's where you really get into the meat of where story matters. And he does touch on this a little bit, but I would like to see like a more in-depth look at this. And I understand this book wasn't really the format for that, but it's still, I think it still is a good book. It's a little bit dated on some of the things in it, but overall, it's a fun book to read. Personally, I think there are some other books that I would recommend before this one, but if you've read all of those, then, you know, by all means try this one out. Anyway, guys, that's all I have for you this time. I'm not sure what book I'm going to read for the next one, but let me know what you think in the comments below. If you hated this video, if you liked it, if you thought I rambled on too much about stuff that nobody cares about or isn't in this book, please let me know. It's honestly the only way I'm going to get better, is if I get criticism and then try to incorporate it. Anyway, I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will talk to you all later.